The call came in at 2:07 a.m. Not 2 o'clock, not 2:15. The screen said 2:07 and Pete's name, and that was the last normal thing about the night. Cal Briggs was not a man who slept hard. 41 years of bow season, gun season, squirrel season, and the kind of restless practicality that kept a man employed and solvent in Alton County had trained his body to surface quickly from sleep. He was awake before the second vibration. He read the screen in the dark, and he picked up. There was no greeting. His brother's voice came through flat and close, like Pete was holding the phone against his chin, and what he said was, "Come now." And then the line was live, but there was no more talking. Cal said, "Pete." He said it twice. He heard wind through a phone speaker, the kind of wind that moves through hardwoods in early November, and then nothing. He was in his truck in 4 minutes, not dressed for hunting, just jeans, and the flannel shirt. He'd pulled off the bedroom chair and his lace-up work boots that he tied in the dark by feel. He did not call back. He knew his brother's voice, and he knew something was wrong with it, and he did not need more information than that. Pete Briggs was 47 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life in the woods. He'd worked timber crews out of Ellsworth for 12 years before his knees made bucking logs a negotiation rather than a certainty. And after that, he'd gone to work for Alton County Roads, which kept him outside and kept him moving and suited him the same way the timber work had. He knew how to fall quietly on a hill. He knew how to field dress a deer in the dark by headlamp with cold hands and not rush it and not make mistakes. He did not panic. He had not panicked when a skidder rolled in 2009 and took out the man running it. And Pete had stayed on the scene for 2 hours, with his belt on the man's leg until the ambulance got up the fire road. He had not panicked then. His voice on the phone had been wrong in a way that went deeper than panic. Cal knew the difference. The stand was on the Lessing parcel, 1,100 acres of mixed hardwood that abutted the state forest boundary along its northern edge. Pete had been hunting a saddle on the eastern ridge for going on 9 years. He had a wooden ladder stand in a white oak that he'd put up in 2015 and reinforced with new hardware every season because he was particular about that kind of thing. He knew that parcel the way men know ground they've walked in every weather. He knew where the field mice concentrated in the corn stubble at the lower edge. He knew which creek branch ran last in a drought and which ran first after rain. He knew where the scrapes were and which of them were active and which were cosmetic. Cal drove 22 minutes on county roads, no traffic at that hour, November fog sitting in the low places between fields. He turned off State Road 9 onto the 2-track that ran to the Lessing parking area, which was a gravel pull-off behind a steel gate that Pete had a key for. And he drove in with his headlights off after the gate because Pete had asked him to do that once years ago, and he'd never forgotten. He parked next to Pete's F250 and cut the engine and sat for a moment in the dark. The silence was the first wrong thing. He sat with the truck window down and he listened. November in Alton County meant coyotes most nights, their chorus carrying a long distance in cold air. It meant the occasional great horned owl from the state forest edge. It meant a wood duck or two moving off the creek channel at odd hours. There was none of that. The air was absolutely still. No coyotes, no owl, nothing from the creek. And the silence had a quality to it that Cal noticed, but did not yet name. He got out of the truck and closed the door by pressing it carefully into the latch, and he stood in the gravel and listened for another minute. His headlamp was on his head, He had the compound bow from the back seat, not because he'd thought about it, but because his hands had picked it up by habit. He had his phone. He had the small fixed blade on his belt that had been there every day for 11 years. He turned the headlamp to its lowest setting, enough to see the trail. He texted Pete, "I'm here. Coming in." No reply. The trail to the saddle stand was 430 yards. Cal had walked it dozens of times as Pete's company and backup driver on the long-haul seasons. He knew the trail bent left at a downed ash and climbed briefly before leveling to the saddle. He walked it now at what felt like the right pace, not rushing, not slow. The headlamp made a low amber circle on the leaves ahead of him. At the 200-yard mark, he stopped. Something had moved to his left and above him on the ridge. Not a deer sound, not the brush and paws of a whitetail ghosting away through the timber. Something had stopped when he stopped. He knew the difference between an animal adjusting its position and something that was reading him. He stood for 40 seconds and there was nothing more. He kept walking. The stand was another 230 yards up the trail. He saw the headlamp first, Pete's orange-beamed Petzl at about 50 yards. It was aimed down the ridge rather than up toward the stand, which was wrong. The latter stand was 12 feet up the white oak. Pete was not in it. He was at the base of the tree. Cal put his headlamp on Pete's face and held it there for 1 second before he angled it off, because what was on his brother's face was not something he wanted to hold a light on. Pete was sitting against the base of the oak with his back against the bark and both hands in his lap, and his Petzl aimed out into the timber down the ridge. He was wearing his full hunting kit, the late-season insulated bibs and the Sitka jacket, and his wool beanie. And everything about his posture said he had come down the ladder and sat down against the tree, and had not moved since. Cal crouched next to him and said his name. Pete looked at him. His eyes were fine. They tracked normally. He was not hurt. He put a hand on Cal's forearm and pressed it and said, with the same flat quality as the phone call, "It's still out there." Cal looked down the ridge into the dark. His headlamp on its lowest setting reached maybe 20 feet. Beyond that was nothing. He said, "What is?" Pete said, "Keep your light off." So Cal turned the headlamp off, and they sat in the dark against the base of the white oak. And Pete said very quietly that he'd been in the stand since 9 p.m. A clear night, cold stars. He'd had deer moving at about 10:30, a small group, 4 does and a button buck coming through the saddle from the north. And he'd passed on them and watched them go. After that, nothing. He'd been on his phone after midnight just to stay awake, reading a long article about road construction equipment because that was what he read when he was bored. At 1:15, he had put the phone away and gone back to glassing the saddle. He said, "I noticed the deer were gone. Not just the does, all of them. The squirrels had been moving all night. You could hear them in the leaves, and they stopped too. Everything stopped at the same time. I've been in these woods for 30 years, and I've never heard them go that quiet that fast." He paused. He said, "I smelled it first." Cal waited. "Calla?" Pete said the smell was organic and musky. Not like deer musk and not like a fox. Nothing he'd ever placed before. Something with a heavy animal quality to it, but underneath that, something else he didn't have a word for. It had come from below the stand, from downwind, which was wrong because whatever was moving should not have been able to come from downwind without crossing a field edge or the creek drainage. He'd started scanning. He'd seen the eyes at 124. He knew the time because he looked at his phone to mark it. The eyes were at what he first judged to be 6 to 7 feet off the ground. Amber self-lit quality to them. Not the flat, tapetum reflection of a deer or coyote. They were spaced wide. He put them at 8 to 9 inches between pupils. They did not blink for a long time. When they moved upright, not the low-slung drift of a four-legged animal in cover. They moved like something walking on two legs, which his brain tried to reclassify for the full time he was watching them. He said, "I've been hunting since I was 12. I know bear movement. Bears don't move like that." "That's not what I'm talking about." He said this without emphasis, the way he would have said the road surface on County 7 was deteriorating and would need patching before spring. Observational, not asking to be believed, just accounting. He'd watched the eyes for 6 minutes. They did not come closer and they did not leave. They held at approximately 40 yards out from the base of his tree, below him and to the northeast, visible through a gap in the canopy where the saddle opened slightly. At 1:30, the eyes went dark. Not like an animal turning its head, like a light going out. He had sat in the stand for another 20 minutes, with his release on his string and his bow drawn to anchor, twice before he came down the ladder. Coming down was the part that had gone wrong, he said. Halfway down, I heard it breathe. He demonstrated pulling a long, slow breath through his nose. He said it had a resonance to it, a low vibration in the chest that seemed too large for what the chest cavity of any known animal could produce at that distance. He said it was maybe 12 feet from the base of the tree when he heard it. He said he couldn't see it. He said he had come down the rest of the ladder at what he could only describe as a controlled fall, hit the ground, put his back against the bark and taken out his phone, and called Cal without looking away from the dark in front of him. That had been 43 minutes ago. Cal sat with all of that for a moment. He was not given to disbelief without evidence, but he was not a man who took the word of a single account, even his brother's, without running through alternatives. He thought about the eyes. He thought about what he knew that could put amber eye shine at 6 or 7 feet off the ground in these woods. Black bear was the obvious candidate, and bears had been in the county for going on 12 years. He knew bear movement. Pete knew it better. He thought about the smell Pete had described. He thought about the sound on the ladder. He thought about the silence, which he himself had noticed from the parking area, which added a data point Pete hadn't given him. He said, "Which direction?" Pete said, "Northeast. Maybe 30 yards now." Cal said, "Now." Pete said, "I can smell it." Cal lifted his head. There was wind from the south, light and intermittent. From the northeast at 30 yards, even intermittently, he should have been catching something. He waited for a gust, and then he did. It hit him across the face, and it was wrong in the way Pete had described. Heavy and animal, and underneath, that something else, something with a chemical edge. Nothing his cataloged experience could match to any known source. He stood up from the ground. He had the bow, but he knew the bow was the wrong tool in the dark at close range against something that large. He put the bow against the tree and took out his phone and turned on the flashlight function and aimed it northeast into the timber. The light reached 30, 40 feet. Hardwood trunks, leafless understory, the ground cover of fallen leaves. Nothing moved. His light was not strong enough and the terrain was not open enough to see to 40 yards. but he swept it carefully from the far left to the far right of the northeast quadrant, and there was nothing visible. He kept the phone light on and with his other hand reached down and pulled Pete up by the arm. He said, "We're going to the truck." Pete said, "Don't run." He said it as information, not as caution, the way a man who has already thought through the problem says the answer. They walked back down the trail at a deliberate pace, Cal with the phone light aimed forward, Pete just behind him and slightly to the right. Cal counted the steps. He had walked this trail enough to know the landmarks, the downed ash at the bend, the root section where the trail dropped briefly before the flat. He counted to the downed ash and they took the left, and he looked back once. At the edge of his phone light, right at the limit of what the beam could touch before it fell off into dark, there was a silhouette. It was standing upright. He registered height and width, and the shape of a head above a set of shoulders that were too wide, and then the light was off that section of trail, and they were moving forward, and he did not look back again. They got to the gate. They got to the trucks. Cal kept the phone light on the trail behind them the entire way. Nothing followed them into the gravel pull-off. Or if it did, it stopped at the tree line, which was 20 yards from where they stood. Pete drove his truck to the gate and Cal drove his out, and they relocked the gate and they drove to Pete's house, which was 6 miles away in town. They did not talk on the way. Cal sat in Pete's kitchen at 3:15 a.m. and drank coffee, while Pete changed out of his hunting kit. And when Pete came back down, he sat across the table, and they were both quiet for a while. Pete's wife, Karen, was upstairs. She'd come to the top of the stairs when they came in, and Pete had told her it was fine, just come in for coffee, and she'd gone back. She had learned over 20 years of marriage that Pete did not exaggerate, and that fine meant no one was hurt, and not necessarily that everything was all right. And she was wise enough to know the difference. Cal said, "How tall? Give me your best estimate." Pete put both hands flat on the table. He spread his fingers wide and looked at them. He said, "I was 12 feet up in that stand. The eyes were at my eye level, maybe a foot below. So call it 10.5, 11 feet. Cal said, "You're sure?" Pete said, "I had the scrape at the base of the oak as a height reference. I marked that scrape in October. It's at 4.5 feet. The eyes were more than twice that." Cal didn't say anything. Pete said, "I know what I saw." They talked through the rest of it. Cal had a habit of going over evidence the way he went over equipment manifests, line by line, looking for error and not finding it. He asked about the smell a second time, and Pete described it again in the same words. He asked about the sound on the ladder. Pete demonstrated it again. He asked about the movement of the eyes through the canopy gap, whether there was any way the height could have been a function of slope and distance, whether a bear up the ridge could have appeared elevated from the stand's angle. Pete walked him through the saddle's actual topography. The tree line in the northeast quadrant was level with the stand, not above it. The slope at that point was flat. The eyes were not elevated by terrain. They were elevated by whatever was holding them. Cal drove home at 4:20 a.m., with the sky still fully dark. He lived on 11 acres outside of town, a small frame house with a detached shop where he kept his equipment. He had 2 dogs, a 6-year-old Walker hound named Birch, and a 4-year-old mixed hound named Vest. They slept in the house. He came in the side door quietly, and both dogs were in the hallway, standing, not barking, their bodies tight and their noses at the door gap. He had to step past them to get in. They pressed against his legs and followed him to the kitchen and stood at the back door and would not settle. He stood at the kitchen counter and drank a glass of water and looked at the dogs. Birch was 9 years into working dog experience and had never been easily spooked. He was the kind of animal that walked through deer scent without tensing, that ignored fox smell, that had been on bear tracks twice and handled it correctly. He was standing at the back door with his tail down and his hackles up, and his body oriented to something outside at the tree line. Cal unlocked the back door and opened it and stood in the doorway and looked out. His shop light was on a motion sensor. It was off. Nothing in the yard had triggered it. The yard was 40 yards deep before it hit a tree line of mixed cedar and hardwood. He stood in the doorway for 90 seconds. Nothing moved. The yard light stayed off. He locked the door and made the dogs come to their beds in the living room, which required more insistence than usual, and sat in the chair by the front window until 5:15, when the sky started coming gray. He called Pete at 7 a.m. Pete had already driven back out to the Lessing parcel at first light. He had found the ground below the white oak stand. He described what he found slowly and in sequence. 2 impressions in the damp soil, partial track shapes that were not bear and not deer, and not any known canid. The toe impressions were elongated, and the stride length between them was 68 inches. He had found a section of siding on a wooden fence post at the east edge of the Lessing property, where something had gripped the post. The marks in the wood were parallel gouges, deep enough to raise a curl of wood fiber, spaced at what Pete measured as 3.5 inches per gouge, with 5 gouges in the set. Pete said, "I took pictures of everything." He said, "The stride length, I looked it up. Nothing in North America walks upright with a 68-inch stride. Nothing." Cal said, "I know." There was a moment of quiet on the line. Then Pete said, "My bow was still against the tree where you left it. It was fine. Nothing had touched it." He said that last part, like a man noting that the thing had had the opportunity and had not taken it, which was its own kind of data. Cal pulled up the county non-emergency line that afternoon and made a report, keeping it simple, describing large, unidentified animal tracks near the Lessing property boundary with the state forest. The woman who took the call was professionally attentive and said a wildlife officer would follow up. No wildlife officer called back that day. He called the district office of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency the following morning and described the track dimensions and left a message with his number. No one called back that week. He and Pete went back to the Lessing parcel 3 days later on a Thursday morning with a full kit. They had Cal's good DSLR and a tape measure and a casting kit for track impressions and a spray bottle of luminescent powder that Pete used for trail marking. They found the partial impression still intact in the compacted soil at the base of the stand. They found 3 more stride spans on the approach to the tree line from the northeast. They found on the trunk of a maple 60 yards from the stand a series of parallel gouges at a height of 9 feet, 4 inches. The gouges were fresh enough that the wood fiber was still pale and unweathered. There were 5 of them in 2 groups, one set lower, one set higher, as if whatever made them had reached first at one height and then stretched. Pete ran the tape from the lower set to the upper set. He read the number and did not say anything for a moment. He looked at Cal. He said, 4 feet between reach points. Cal photographed both sets in the same frame with Pete's arm as a scale reference. He shot 24 images of the track impressions, each with the tape measure included. He photographed the fence post marks. He wrote down the GPS coordinates on his phone for all 6 evidence points. They drove back out to the road and sat in Cal's truck with the heat running and looked at the photographs on the camera's screen. Pete scrolled through them one at a time. When he was finished, he handed the camera back without comment. Cal said, "You hunting that stand again?" Pete looked out the windshield. He said, "Karen wants us to tell her what happened." Cal understood this was not an answer to his question. He said, "What did you tell her?" Pete said, "I told her I saw something I couldn't explain and that I didn't want her to worry." He paused. She said that was the wrong answer. Karen Briggs was not a woman who managed well on partial information. She was a practical woman who worked in medical records at the county hospital and whose particular professional skill was identifying when a chart was incomplete in a way that mattered. She had read Pete's face when they walked in at 3:15 a.m., and she had let it rest for 48 hours, and then she had sat across from him at the dinner table and waited. Pete had told her the account. All of it. The eyes and the smell and the sound on the ladder and the tracks. Cal was not there for that conversation, but Pete relayed it to him the following day, with the flat precision that characterized everything Pete did. Karen had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she had sat with it for a moment and then asked 2 questions. The first was whether the animal had shown any behavior that suggested it was leaving the area. The second was whether they were planning to go back. Pete said he didn't know, and yes, for the evidence work. She had said, "I want you to carry the rifle." He'd started to explain that the rifle was a different permit and the season was not open for anything that would require the rifle on the Lessing parcel. And she said, "I know what I said." They did not argue about it further. He had taken the 3006 back out on the evidence run, and it had been on the seat between them when they photographed the tracks. The 4th night came. It was 9 days after the original call. Pete had not been back in the stand. He had driven the perimeter road of the Lessing parcel twice in the intervening week, and on the second drive, on a Tuesday afternoon, he had found a section of the fence along the east boundary where something had pushed through the wire. Not broken it cleanly, but pressed through it, bending the wire in a downward arc that suggested a mass pushing forward rather than under. The wire was cattle gauge, thick enough that Pete had to use both hands to push a section down when he was scouting the field edge. Whatever had gone through it had not used both hands. Cal drove out to see it. They stood at the fence section and looked at the bent wire and then at the field beyond it, a soybean stubble field that extended east to a woodlot a quarter mile away. The impressions in the soft ground on the far side of the fence were partial but present. They continued east. Whatever had pushed through that fence had come through it heading away from the Lessing parcel, heading toward town. Pete looked at Cal. He said, 6 miles. Your place is 6 miles east. Cal said, "I know." He drove home directly. His dogs were in the yard when he pulled in, which was wrong because he had left them in the house with the dog door latched. He checked the side door and it was still latched, and the door was still closed. He walked around the house, and on the north side, facing the tree line, the crawl space vent cover was off. Not damaged, not broken. The 4 screws that held it in place were on the ground in the dead grass below it. They had not been stripped. They had been removed. The vent opening was 14 inches wide and 11 inches tall, too small for anything large to enter through. But something had removed that cover deliberately, and he did not know when. and he did not know why. He stood in the dead grass and looked at the screws in the palm of his hand. They were dirty. They had been in place for years, and now they were in his hand and the cover was on the ground. Birch was at his leg. The dog's nose was going constantly and his body was turned toward the crawl space opening. Cal put the cover back on by hand, without the screws, and went inside and called his wife at her office. She and their son were staying at her mother's in Calhoun this week, a prior arrangement for her sister's birthday, and he told her the visit had gone well and asked how his son was doing and did not say anything else. His son was 9 years old and was named after Cal's father, Walt Jr., which was what they called him. He was in Calhoun at his grandmother's house with his mother, and Cal intended that he stay there a while longer. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen with Birch on one side and Vest on the other, and the 12-gauge across his knees, and every light in the house on. He had bought a 2-pack of motion-activated floodlights 6 days earlier at the hardware store in town, and had mounted them on the back and north eaves of the house that afternoon, wired to a dedicated breaker. He had tested them twice before dark. They worked. At 1:51 a.m., the north light came on. He was at the back window in 3 seconds, which was as fast as he could move from the kitchen chair to the window at the back wall. The north light was burning white over the yard, reaching the tree line and past it slightly into the first row of cedars. He could see the yard completely. He could see the fence line and the shop and the back edge of his truck in the driveway. He could not see what had triggered the light. The sensor reset after 4 minutes. The light went off. He stood at the window in the dark with his hand on the switch for the interior kitchen light, ready to kill it. The yard went back to darkness. He waited. At 2:06, the north light came back on. He saw it this time. It was at the tree line at the northern edge where the cedars started, and it was not entirely visible. It was behind 2 trunks, with the light at an angle, but what he could see was the upper portion of a form that was standing upright against the tree line, and the height of it registered against the cedar trunks as being considerably above where a man's shoulders would be. The form was dark, darker than the shadows behind it. He could see width across the upper chest and shoulders. He could not see the head above the shoulder line because it was above the floodlight's primary cone and in shadow. He saw one arm, or what he took to be an arm, a long, dark mass hanging lower than a human arm would hang relative to the shoulder. The eyes, he saw them, and they were everything Pete had described. Amber, self-luminous quality, too wide apart, reflecting nothing because they were not reflecting the light but producing their own warmth. And they were watching him through the window glass from 60 feet away. And they held steady and did not blink. He stood at the window and he did not move. He did not know how long he stood there. He thought it was less than a minute, but he could not be certain. The floodlight was on a 4-minute sensor cycle, and it had still not reset when the form moved. Not quickly. It moved the way something moves when it has decided to move, rather than the way something moves when it has been startled. It went back into the cedar row, and then it was gone. Just the trees, just the floodlight, burning on an empty yard. The light cycled off. He stayed at the window. He called Pete at 2:14. He described what he had seen while it was still in his immediate memory. He kept his voice level. He described the tree line position, the shoulder height relative to the cedar trunks, the arm length, the eyes. He described the deliberate quality of the movement when it went. He told Pete about the vent cover screws. Pete was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It followed you." Cal said, "Or it knew where I lived already." Neither of them had an answer to that. He replaced the crawl space vent the next morning with a steel mesh panel that he screwed into the framing with 2-inch lag bolts, 16 of them, set close enough together that nothing with fingers could work them out from the outside without a tool. He found the area below his north tree line and walked it slowly for an hour with Birch on a lead. The dog worked hard, nose down, pulling forward, and stopped at 2 places where the ground was soft enough under the cedar needles to hold an impression. The impressions were partial. One of them had a toe definition. He photographed it with the tape measure alongside it, and then he stood up and looked at his house from the tree line and thought about the geometry of it. From where he stood, he could see the north window of his son's bedroom. He thought about that for a long time. He spent the rest of that day making calls. The county sheriff's non-emergency line produced a deputy who listened and said he'd have a patrol car do extra runs on Cal's road for the next few nights. The patrol car came twice at odd hours over the following 3 days, and Cal watched it go by from his window. He did not expect it to be sufficient, and it was not. He was not angry about that. The deputy had done what the deputy could do. The category of what Cal was dealing with was not one that fell inside the operational capacity of a county patrol car on a rural road, and he knew that and had known it before he made the call. He made a list, the way he made equipment lists, concrete and sequenced. He wrote down what had been observed and when and by whom, and what physical evidence existed for each event. He had the photographs from the Lessing parcel on his phone and the track castings they'd made in plaster, which were stored in the shop in a cardboard box. He had the photograph of the fence post gouges with Pete's arm as scale. He had the photograph of the vent cover on the ground with the screws beside it. He had the image from the north window burned into his memory, which was not evidence anyone else could verify. He and Pete drove out to the Lessing saddle one more time on a Friday morning 3 days after the window sighting. They found that the white oak stand had been touched, not destroyed. The platform was intact, but the wooden steps nailed to the trunk below the ladder section, the screw-in steps that Pete used to access the ladder from the ground, 3 of them had been removed. They were on the ground at the base of the tree. They had been pulled out of the wood cleanly without breaking. Pete picked one up and turned it in his hands. He said, "Those are 3/8-inch lag bolts. I drove them myself with a ratchet and a 17mm socket." He looked at the holes in the bark where the bolts had been. The wood around each hole was compressed, not torn. Something had gripped the bolt head and turned it. 3/8-inch socket on a bolt head that was set into bark and wood fiber and had been there through 4 seasons of freeze and thaw. Cal said, "It wanted the steps down." Pete put the bolt on the ground carefully. He looked up at the stand platform 12 feet overhead and then down the ridge to the northeast. He said, "It knew I came down the steps." They drove back to town in the same silence as before. Cal had his son's baseball gear in the back of his truck, a bag that had been back there since a late October game and that he'd been meaning to bring in. The red bag with the number 9 on it in iron-on letters, because Walt Jr. played catcher and wore 9. He looked at the bag in the rear-view mirror. He called his wife that afternoon and told her to stay through the weekend at her mother's. She asked why, and he said the weather was going to turn and the road was going to be bad, and he'd rather she and Walt Jr. were comfortable. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said his name. He said, "I'll explain when I see you." She said, "Is this about something Pete saw?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you safe right now?" He said, "Yes." And he meant it. He was in the kitchen in daylight, and the dogs were calm, and the yard was empty. She told him to call her if that changed, and he said he would. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photographs on his phone, scrolling through them slowly, the lessing tracks, the fence post marks, the bent fence wire, the vent cover. He forwarded them all to Pete's phone in a single batch, and then he sent Pete a text message that said, "I'm going to set up in my back tree line tonight." Pete replied in 3 minutes, "I'll be there at dark." He was. They set up 2 camp chairs in the cedars at the north tree line, set back from the gap where the impressions had been found, facing the house. They had the 30-06 and the 12 gauge and 2 thermoses of coffee and Birch, who sat between them without being asked and pointed his nose at the dark beyond the tree line with a steadiness that was itself a kind of instrument. They sat from 8 p.m. until 3 a.m. without incident, without sound, without the north floodlight triggering. The sky was overcast and the temperature was dropping, and a light freezing rain started just after midnight, and they sat in it without complaint because they had both sat in worse. At 3:11 a.m. Birch turned his head. Not forward, not to the north. He turned east toward the road, and the sound that came with the head turn reached Cal 2 seconds later. A footfall in the frozen grass, then another. Something walking on the east side of the tree line, parallel to it, moving south. Moving toward the gap where the vent cover had been photographed, toward the north face of the house. Cal and Pete looked at each other in the dark. No signal needed. Cal had the 12 gauge and Pete had the 30-06, and they were both up from the chairs and moving. Cal went left toward the house, and Pete held at the tree line, and that was the arrangement without discussion, because they had known each other for 47 years, and that was how they solved problems. Cal cleared the cedar row and came around the north face of the house, and he put his hand on the new steel mesh panel over the crawl space vent, and it was intact. The lag bolts were tight. He stood in the yard and turned on his headlamp. The north floodlight came on from the motion trigger at the same moment, flooding the yard white. And Cal had both the headlamp and the floodlight, and he turned in a full, slow circle. The yard was empty. The frozen grass to the east was flattened in a trail that went to the road and stopped at the road edge because the asphalt held no impression. He followed the flattened trail to the road and stood at the edge and looked both directions down the empty county road in the dark. Nothing moving. The floodlight cycled back off from behind him, and he was standing at the road edge in the dark with the headlamp and the cold and the smell of freezing rain. He looked at the road. On the asphalt shoulder, barely visible in the headlamp's angle, pressed into the thin layer of freezing rain that had begun to glaze the surface, was the leading edge of an impression. One impression only, at the road shoulder, where something had stepped from the grass onto the asphalt and continued. Half a footprint. Elongated toe definitions. The part of the track that the asphalt held before the foot came fully down on a surface that would not keep the shape. He crouched over it for a long time. Pete was at his shoulder. Neither of them said anything. Cal took out his phone and photographed the impression in the headlamp beam, holding the light at a low angle to create shadow definition in the glaze. He took 6 photographs. He stood up. Down the road to the south, in the direction the trail continued, his neighbor Garvin Sears lived 3/4 of a mile away. Garvin was 70 years old and had a small cattle operation. He had a barn, he had a dog that ran loose, that he had told Cal 2 weeks earlier offhand over the fence while they talked about road drainage that his dog had been staying on the porch lately and wouldn't go to the barn at night, which Garvin had put down to the cold. Cal looked down that road. He got out his phone and texted Garvin, "Call me when you're up. Need to talk to you about something on the road." Then he stood at the shoulder of County Road 14 in the freezing rain with the half-print in the glaze at his feet, and the dark south of him and Pete, standing 3 feet away with the 30-06 at low carry. And he thought about his son's baseball bag in the back of his truck and his wife at her mother's in Calhoun and the lag bolts he'd sunk into the crawl space framing and the steps pulled clean from the white oak on the Lessing parcel. And he brought up the photographs of all of it on his phone, one after another, and looked at them with the headlamp as a reading light, and what he felt was not panic, it was not grief, it was not the feeling of a man who did not know what to do next. It was the feeling of a man who knew exactly what he was dealing with and was calculating the distance from where he stood to the nearest light on the road south.